Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to TMCC's 10th annual Constitution Day event. Today we have a very special guest. We have Judge Weller to talk to us about the Emancipation Proclamation, but I just wanted to take a second to talk to you about this event. Every year on September 17th, we take just one day and we look at the United States Constitution, and our goal is to try to understand this document that contains so many nuances and complexities that it continues to interest us and confound us even to this day. Judge Chuck Weller is here today, and he is going to talk to us about one aspect of the Constitution that's relevant based on a visit we are going to have from a document, if a document can visit. I'm not sure if a document can visit. I guess it can. Sure, why not? It won't be under its own power as it visits, but it will come. And so we're going to talk today about the Emancipation Proclamation and the Constitution. So we have two guests, actually. The first guest, as I've mentioned, is Judge Chuck Weller. He is a district court judge in the Family Division in Washoe County. Before that, he was a judge an attorney for 21 years. He was a talk show host on radio on KOH. He was a columnist for the RGJ, and he just recently earned his PhD in judicial studies. After Judge Weller finishes his presentation, we also have Colin Robertson here, a good friend of mine, who is the curator of education at the Nevada Museum of Art. This is the place that is holding the exhibit where the Emancipation Proclamation will be displayed, and he will talk to you some about that. So, without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Judge Chuck Weller. Judge Weller, thank you.
I want to thank Professor Reed for inviting me to come to TMC for this annual celebration, and I want to thank TMCC. It's a great resource for this community, not only for the fact that they've employed my wife as an instructor for 10 years, but also because of the fact that I don't know how we'd live as a community without you. I do family court all the time, and I always like it when I see somebody in front of me, a family in trouble, and they've got students attending TMCC. Today is the 227th anniversary of the United States Constitution, and something very exciting and rare about the Constitution is about to happen in Reno, Nevada, the visit of the original Emancipation Proclamation. And it's just amazing that we're going to have it here in Reno, signed by President Lincoln, and it's going to be at the Nevada Art Museum. I want to briefly discuss with you the connection between the Constitution and the Emancipation Proclamation and the statehood of Nevada that occurred 150 years ago this year. It all started with the Constitutional Convention. The delegates met in Independence Hall in Philadelphia. They decided that George Washington should be the chair in charge of the convention. And if you look at the dates, it lasted less than 4 months, and they wrote the entire Constitution. I don't know what's happened to politicians since that time, but it's very doubtful that we could get the people in Washington today to write the United States Constitution in less than 4 months. And it was finished and ratified by the state delegations on September 17th, 1787, 227 years ago today. For most issues that were before the Constitutional Convention, there was agreement. The people there were educated. They knew the history of the development of law and government in England. They knew the classical resources from Greece and Rome, and for most things, like having 2 houses of the legislature and 3 branches of government, for most things, they could come to agreement very easily. But there were some things that they couldn't come to agreement on very easily, and one of those things was slavery. Slavery pre-existed the Constitution in the Americas. Slavery existed in all 13 colonies in 1776 when the Declaration of Independence was signed. And 11 years later, when they sat down to write the Constitution, it still existed in 11 of the states. Only Massachusetts and New Hampshire had abolished slavery. About half of the delegates at the Constitutional Convention were slave owners. Even though the term slavery does not exist in the constitutional document, it was discussed extensively in the document, and it protected slavery. One of the places that it protected slavery is what's called the Three-Fifths Compromise. Blacks were not given the vote in the Constitution, but the people from the slave states wanted to count the slaves as voters for purposes of figuring out how much representation they would have in the House of Representatives. And the people from states that didn't like slavery didn't want to count the slaves at all because they didn't have a right to vote. There was a compromise made, and the compromise was that every slave would be counted as 3/5 of a person for purposes of determining what representation would be in the House of Representatives. Those votes didn't go to the slaves. Those votes went to the slave holders. Okay? This had an immediate impact. It gave the slave states greater representation than they would have had if only voters were allowed to be counted. When we came to the election of the third president of the United States, Thomas Jefferson, who owned about 300 slaves, it's unlikely that he would have been elected had it not been for this provision. Okay, Aaron Burr might well have been the third president of the United States, but Thomas Jefferson from Virginia benefited from the fact that his slaves and the slaves of other people in his state and other states were counted in determining representation. One kind of ironic fact is that when the Civil War was over and the slaves were freed and the former slaves were counted as a whole person rather than 3/5 of a person, is it greatly increased the representation from the southern states. So they came out of the war actually with greater representation than they had prior to the war. This is another provision in the original Constitution that protected slavery. It said that the importation of slaves could not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, 20 years after the Constitution was ratified. The reason that this provision was included in the Constitution is that South Carolina and Georgia said that they wouldn't join the Union unless it was included. So it was included. So what it did is it protected slavery for at least 20 years after the enactment of the Constitution. All other kinds of commerce were subject to regulation except slavery. It was given a special status. This is another provision in the original Constitution, and it's a fugitive slave provision, and what it says is if you're a slave and you escape and you get to a free state, that you are not free. The state where you go is required to return you into bondage. Slaves were considered to be property, not to be human beings, and the Constitution very specifically said slaves need to be returned. They're not free just because they escape. Sometimes we think of the Constitution as being handed down from heaven. It wasn't. It was created by men, and they were imperfect, and they made a lot of compromises. And there's no greater example than the Constitution's provisions on slavery. Another provision of the original Constitution said that the United States shall protect every state from domestic violence. I'm a family court judge, and domestic violence has a different meaning to me today than it did at the time of the Constitution. What this meant, largely, was if the slaves ever rebel and try to gain their freedom, that the force of the United States government, Army, and Navy would be required to assist the slave owners in putting down any kind of insurrection. Another provision that protected slavery in the Constitution that is still actually with us today is the amendment process of the Constitution. In order to have an amendment to the Constitution, you need to get a 2/3 vote of both the Senate and the House of Representatives, and you have to get ratification by 3/4 of the states. Well, the time that the Civil War started, there were 15 slave-holding states. If you wanted to get 3/4 to overwhelm that, you would have needed a country with 61 states, which we haven't achieved even today. So the Constitution pretty strongly protected the institution of slavery. All right, so that was in 1787. By 1858, slavery was a big topic in the United States, and there were people who liked it and people who didn't like it. And one place that it was talked about very prominently was when Abraham Lincoln ran for the Senate in Illinois. And that was in 1858, 2 years before he was elected the President of the United States. And he had a series of very famous debates called the Lincoln-Douglas debates. And the issue of the primary issue of the Lincoln-Douglas debates was slavery. Okay. Douglas actually won the Senate seat, but Lincoln published the text of the Lincoln-Douglas debates, and that's how he got national prominence, and it's how he became the President of the United States. He said some things during these debates that caused people who were against slavery to be happy and people who were for slavery to fear him. One thing he did is he called slavery a monstrous injustice. And he said we should get rid of it. And he was talking largely about the new states that were becoming states. He also, and when he said that, the people in slave states didn't like it very well. But he also said, I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. I believe I have no lawful right to do so, and I have no inclination to do so. Lincoln was a lawyer. He could read the Constitution. The Constitution said slavery's okay, and he couldn't get rid of the Constitution except through the amendment process, which was impossible, as we've just gone through. So Lincoln recognized that slavery was part of America, and that's the way it was, and he said so in this debate. As I said, the Lincoln-Douglas debates, the text of them was published, and it propelled Lincoln into national prominence, and in 1860 he was elected the President of the United States. The southern states were concerned because Lincoln said things like it's a monstrous institution, and 7 southern states seceded from the Union between the time Lincoln was elected in November of 1860 and his inauguration. Okay. This is a photograph of Lincoln's first inauguration in early March 1861. When he took the stand, 7 states had seceded from the Union, but there was no Civil War yet, and Lincoln hoped to convince those states to come back into the Union. And he said, he quoted himself from the Lincoln-Douglas debates and made the exact same statement, that I'm not against slavery, and I don't have the lawful right to get rid of it, and I have no inclination to get rid of it. A month later, just a month after his inauguration, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in South Carolina, and the Civil War was on. Lincoln considered lots of ways of ending the Civil War without abolishing slavery because he didn't think he could do it under the Constitution. He proposed buying all the slaves from the slave owners for $300 a head and moving them outside the United States to a colony. And Congress actually appropriated monies for this colonization. The slave states said no. He thought of a lot of different ideas and nothing worked. Eventually, his generals began to tell him that slavery was sustaining the war against the North, that the slaves, by working in the fields, were freeing the whites to go into combat against the North, and by providing food and stuff, they were supporting the military. And Lincoln began to look at the Constitution in another way. He looked at other provisions of the Constitution. He saw the provision that said, the President shall be Commander-in-Chief of the Army and Navy of the United States. And he interpreted that to mean that you can confiscate the property of people who are at war with you. he looked at the oath that every president takes. I do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States and will, to the best of my ability, preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution of the United States. And he said, well, this requires me to do things to protect the Constitution. And he said, I felt that measures otherwise unconstitutional might become lawful by becoming indispensable to the preservation of the Constitution through the preservation of the nation. So no longer did he feel constrained by the provisions of the Constitution that specifically authorized slavery. He thought, if I'm going to do something in the former states that are now in rebellion, that I have the power as the commander-in-chief, and under my oath I have the obligation to preserve the Union. So in September of 1862, using this authority, he announced that all slaves in the Confederate areas would be free on January 1st, 1863. Now, the Confederate States might have preserved slavery by laying down their arms and stopping the war, but they didn't. And so he did this in September 1862, about 100 days before the end of the year, and slaves and a lot of other people in America started counting down the days. 99, 98, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. And on January 1st, 1863, as a man of his word, he signed the Emancipation Proclamation that's going to be with us here in Reno in about a month. It was the dawn of a new day. There were festivals all over the United States. I didn't have an opportunity to get to the Historical Society to get the newspapers from Reno at that time, but I'm sure there were celebrations here. There were celebrations everywhere. This is what the Emancipation Proclamation did. Lincoln was very careful not to violate the Constitution. If the Emancipation Proclamation were signed today, it would be called something that you're going to hear about in a little bit in relation to immigration. It would be called an executive order. Okay? It didn't pass through Congress. The president said, I have a right to do this as the president of the United States. It did not outlaw slavery because the Constitution said slavery is legal. It freed the slaves in areas of rebellion. Lincoln said, I can't get rid of slavery in the states, but I can get rid of it in this country, the Confederacy, where they claim they're no longer states of the United States. It did not free any slaves within the Union. In total, it freed 2.9 million human beings, 75% of the total slaves that existed in the Americas at that time. And his generals were right that ending slavery was a step that the commander-in-chief used to help prosecute the war. Over 200,000 former slaves joined the Union Navy and Army. The Emancipation Proclamation, although it didn't end slavery, has always been recognized as a new beginning in America. And if you went to Amazon.com today, you'd find a listing for 5,700 books under the topic of the Emancipation Proclamation. This is what it did. The orange kind of states, those are the states where slavery was outlawed. You see a little bit of yellow in southern Louisiana, and yellow where West Virginia is now is part of Virginia at the time. Those were areas that were under Union control. Missouri, Kentucky, Delaware, and Maryland were slave states that hadn't seceded from the Union. So slavery continued to exist in the red and the yellow, but he banned it in the orange. Here's another map that shows the same thing with a county breakdown. Okay. Nevada statehood came along on October 31st, 1864, 150 years from this coming October 31st. There's some significant things about that. In order to become a state, the Constitution of the state had to be sent back to Washington, D.C. to be approved by the Congress. There were a couple attempts to send the Constitution, the state Constitution, back to Washington, D.C., but they weren't successful. Communication wasn't very effective in those days. So the world's longest telegram at the time was sent to Washington, D.C. with the Constitution. And Congress approved it. Lincoln signed statehood. 8 days later was Election Day, which was not an accident. Lincoln wanted the votes of the people. Lincoln had approved and appointed the people in charge of the state of Nevada when it was just a territory. And he knew that he could count on the state of Nevada to support his election, and he knew that he could count on the state of Nevada to approve his idea, the 13th Amendment, that would change the Constitution and eliminate slavery. So he wanted Nevada to become a state. And so the fact that, as I say, that the election day was 8 days after our statehood was not a coincidence. Statehood was rushed through. You needed about 60,000 people to become a state usually in those days. Nevada had a population of about 40,000 and didn't qualify. But he wanted the statehood, so he did. And the reason Nevada's motto is Battle Born is because we became a state during the Civil War and because of the Civil War. Lincoln recognized that the Emancipation Proclamation didn't do the whole job, and I won't read this whole quote to you, but what he said is, I know I haven't finished the job. I didn't free slaves everywhere, and somebody might challenge my executive order and say that I'm acting like a king and that I didn't have the power to do this. And I want the approval of the Congress, and I want the ratification of the states in a constitutional amendment to end slavery in the United States forever and all. And he recognized that the 13th Amendment was necessary to do that. And this is the 13th Amendment. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for crime, whereof the party shall have been duly convicted, shall exist within the United States, or any place subject to their jurisdiction. And this was passed by Congress on January 31st, 1865. And 16 days later, Nevada did what it was expected to do and ratified it. It was part of the ratification and made the 13th Amendment part of the Constitution of the United States and eliminated slavery forever and all. Lincoln's second inaugural address was on March 4th, 1865. On that day, Lincoln called slavery a national sin. He explained that it wasn't just a sin of the South, that it was also a sin of the North for doing things like agreeing to the Constitution with the provisions that it had in it originally, for benefiting from the work of slaves. And he was on his way. He had an idea to bring the nation back together. This is a photograph of that ceremony. This is a painting in the Capitol building of that ceremony. Okay. This was on March 4th, 1865. The war ended when General Lee surrendered at Appomattox Courthouse on April 9th, just a month later. And then just 6 days after that, President Lincoln was assassinated. So he had eliminated slavery. He had started with the Emancipation Proclamation. And he finished the job by getting the 13th Amendment passed. And Nevada played a significant role in that. And because of the significant role that was played in that, and because of the great work of the Nevada Art Museum, the original Emancipation Proclamation is coming to Reno for the first time ever, I believe. Ever? Okay. And I'd like to introduce to you now Colin Mathewson. I said that, Robertson, who is the Charles N. Mathewson Curator of Education at the Nevada Art Museum, who will share some thoughts with you about the exhibit that's about to come here.
Thank you, Judge Weller and John, for welcoming me here today, and thanks for being part of this conversation. It's really quite moving, I think, to see some of the pictures that Judge Weller has presented, helping to visualize the heritage of the state. There are, John and I have been working together for some years with a group of Washoe County School District social studies people across a range of ages. And we have just had the good fortune this summer in July to work with 51 of the fourth grade teachers in the Washoe County school system. That's a nice number. It's a third of all the fourth grade teachers in the district, which is a better representation of what that means in terms of trying to increase the historical knowledge and awareness of among those teachers and the much larger number of students that they will touch because of that program. And I think part of what I love about Judge Weller's comments, it gets it really at the fragility of the concept of the abolition of slavery between 1863, January 1863, when the proclamation was announced, and Lincoln's assassination April 15th, 1865. Because really what was going on in the United States at that time, without Nevada having become a state in 1864, the reality of slavery being abolished, it would have been much more highly questionable, really. And I think that that's the really beautiful part about this celebration of the Constitution today, and also the exhibition that we are mounting at the Nevada Museum of Art. It opened actually August 2nd, and it runs through November 2nd, just at the conclusion of Nevada Day weekend this year. And it's the Nevada Museum of Art's effort. It's an exhibition originated by us and brought to Nevada. It's taken about 3 years to negotiate all of the extraordinarily complex loan agreements to borrow such important documents to the nation's history from the National Archives and from the Library of Congress, among other organizations, including the State Archives and Library in particular, and the Nevada Historical Society. And I think as an exhibition, it tells a really important story for the public regarding this idea of what we mean when we say battle born. And a lot of times, I think in the public consciousness, people think Nevada, rugged individualism, leave me the hell alone, don't tell me my business, I won't tell you yours kind of idea, that it's sort of I'll pull myself up by my bootstraps kind of individualism. But Judge Weller's comments really get to the point that Battleborn has everything to do with the Civil War in the United States and Nevada becoming an integral part of the solution to the division in the country and to the abolition of slavery across the country. Because, as he also pointed out, there were only about 40,000 people in Nevada in 1864, which was well under the threshold for traditionally for admission into the Union as a state. At the same time, Colorado and Nebraska territories were also considering joining the Union, and they did not. And they remained territories until 1876 and well beyond then. And actually, as a result of the decline of population resulting from the slow loss in production of the Comstock lode. The Comstock lode had everything to do with why there were 40,000 people in Nevada in the 1860s in the first place. And as the Comstock mines began to be exhausted in the late 1880s and into the 1890s, the population of the state declined precipitously, well below the threshold that would have allowed Nevada territory to have become a state subsequently. And what's kind of remarkable about that is that without that sort of series of really rather serendipitous and somewhat lucky and extraordinarily politically savvy moves made in a very short period of time, Nevada might not have become a state, slavery might not have been abolished, and the proclamation might not have been the precipitating force that led to that historic moment when the 13th Amendment was ratified. So I wanted just to mention a couple of things. Documents are, why is this an exhibition at an art museum? We are not a history museum per se, although we deal with historical information all the time and display it in a visual way all of the time. But the Nevada Sesquicentennial Celebration is a really important part of our heritage, and it's an effort by the museum to use our capacity to host really significant documents like this and bring them to the community and to the state. The environmental requirements, I should just mention, this is kind of an interesting factoid, that the Emancipation Proclamation, there is only one Emancipation Proclamation. It lives in a vault below the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and it's on display for 40 hours a year because of the fragility of the paper on which it was written. And the original document will be in Reno for 4 days, 33 hours of the 40 that it's exhibited in 2014 will be here in Reno. And that is the highlight of the exhibition by far, and it basically tries to create a visual narrative exploring the state's heritage and what it really means for us to say that we are battle-born, and something that is really part of the heritage of the anti-slavery initiatives represented by the early population of our state and territory, which is why we have a Nye County, Nevada, named for Governor James Nye. We have a Lincoln County, Nevada, named for President Abraham Lincoln, and the quite strong support for abolition that was, and the Union in particular, that existed in Nevada territory in the 1860s. So the exhibition consists of it's 3 galleries actually in the museum, which is quite a lot of real estate in a museum for an exhibition to take up, and that's illustrated with a number of other really remarkable documents and objects. The exhibition is bookended by a collection of photographs by Timothy O'Sullivan, a very famous American photographer who worked under Matthew Brady and then on his own, but made many of the most famous images of the Civil War using a large format view camera on the battlefield in the 1860s. Those images of principally scenes from Gettysburg and elsewhere in Pennsylvania are the opening act, as it were, of the exhibition, revealing the sort of trauma of the war and its effects on the division of the country. And they're albumin prints. They're the kind of prints that are made by contact with a glass plate negative. I think it's astonishing that any of them survived, in fact, because he would make those photographs with a large format view camera out in the battlefields using a process called wet collodion, and I'll suffice it to say it's an extraordinarily elaborate photographic process that produces a 8 by 10 inch glass plate negative. So some of you are old enough to remember 35 millimeter film. 35 millimeter referring to the frame size of an individual piece of the negative. These were negatives that were 8 by 10 inches, made with a variety of really noxious chemicals, and then made permanent on a piece of plate glass, which was then brought back by wagon, train, and cart through the battlefields to a studio in an urban area, generally in New York City or San Francisco, were the places where a lot of the photography was being developed. And so it's really kind of a wonder that any of the negatives even survived to get back to the urban areas where they could be printed on paper covered in a light-sensitive emulsion made with egg whites. So they're very, very fragile, and that surface treatment can flake off. So when you look at the photographs, you'll see that there's a gap between the matte board and the image itself to keep them safe from disturbing the surface of the image. They're very, very fragile, and it's very dark in the galleries comparatively because of the light requirements of those images to survive for a very long time to come. Adjacent to those opening images then are some of the historical documents telling the stories of the Emancipation Proclamation and Nevada becoming a state. And I'll just mention a couple of them. Governor Nye was the first territorial governor of Nevada. He was appointed by Abraham Lincoln in 1861 to the position of territorial governor. And his job was basically to come out and organize the population and the leaders to agree to the conditions for statehood. And one of the jobs that he had was to convince the United States Congress, and thus President Lincoln, that Nevada Territory was in fact a territory civilized enough to become a state. So there's a 5-page letter in the exhibition handwritten by Governor Nye that says all of the reasons that Nevada should be considered a state, because it is in fact very civilized, and the only thing that we have need of in Nevada is a bank. Which is, it's fun, it's hard to read, and as you know, they are not teaching cursive handwriting to students in the school system these days, so it does require a little bit of translation, but we have printed a copy in text that you can read, and it's actually worth the 15 or 20 minutes it might take you to read those words. When Nevada was becoming a state, in that kind of transition process of the fall of 1864, the original Constitution had 2 certified copies made. So we kept a copy in Nevada, in Carson City, and then 2 certified copies were handwritten by calligraphers and certified by the legislature and sent to Washington, D.C. One by overland mail, over the Overland Trail mail route, and one by ship from San Francisco to Panama, across the Isthmus of Panama, and then up the East Coast. In order, this was in September of 1864, in order for the state's constitution to arrive in Washington, D.C. in enough time for it to be acknowledged by the U.S. legislature and then by President Lincoln. By October 24th, 1864, just less than 2 weeks before the election of the 1864 election, there were telegrams sent that are on display at the museum now that explain, you can hear in the language of those telegrams the fear that the Nevada Constitution has not arrived in Washington. And they are very terse little telegrams sent to the president of the telegram company in Oakland, California, saying, get the word to Governor Blaisdell that we have not received copy of, that the president, Abraham Lincoln, has not received copy of your Constitution. And he was being advised by the cabinet at the time not to proclaim Nevada's statehood without laying eyes on the Constitution himself. So there was this very terse telegram sent saying, the president has not received your Constitution. Get it there, right? And so what resulted was Abraham Lincoln's instruction to Governor Blaisdell to telegraph the Constitution, all 16,000 words of it, across the country in order for it to get there in time prior to the election, where Nevada's 2 key electoral college votes would help to ensure his reelection 2 weeks later. And so what happened was a small conspiracy in Nevada's history where the telegraph company said that they were going to shut down the telegraph lines for 4 days for maintenance, and they began, the stenographers began telegraphing the Constitution 16,000 words across the country, and it had to be relayed 4 times. So it was sent from Carson City to Salt Lake City overnight, and then during the day telegraphed further from Salt Lake City to Chicago, Illinois, and then telegraphed the following night from Chicago to Philadelphia, and the following day from Philadelphia to the War Department in Washington, D.C., where it was handwritten into telegraphed paper by the stenographers at the War Department, and that combined document is on display at the museum right now. You can imagine, just looking at it, the writer's cramp from those poor souls. And it was for about not quite 20 years, the longest telegram in history ever sent, until 1881, when the Bible, the King James Bible, was telegraphed across from London to New York City to Chicago rather, for its publication, first publication in the United States. It's a very beautiful document, and adjacent to it is also then the subsequent proclamation of statehood signed by President Lincoln, explaining that Nevada had been officially admitted to the Union October 31st, 1864, and subsequently then the first state governor of Nevada, Henry Blaisdell, helped to facilitate the passage of the ratification of the 13th Amendment to the Constitution abolishing slavery. And that all happened after the election of 1864, and the Nevada legislature, as was expected, came in support of ratifying the 13th Amendment. It was ratified in February of 1865. Lincoln was inaugurated to his second administration in March of 1865. April 9th, I believe, is the closing date of the Civil War. Yes. And April 15th, he's assassinated. And in that 6-month window is when we become a state, when the height of the Comstock mining boom takes place, and when slavery as an economic and property system in the United States changes forever. And I think that story is one that this exhibition tells very clearly and well, and we really hope that you'll come and see it, celebrate that statehood and its heritage with us, bring your friends and family. There's a lot going on. The original Emancipation Proclamation, there's currently a very high-quality replica in the place where the Emancipation Proclamation will be. And it will arrive by FBI-escorted courier. The Emancipation Proclamation, you might like to know, flies first class in its own ticket, and accompanied by FBI-escorted couriers. And it will be installed on the evening of the 29th of October, and then on display the 30th, 31st, 1st, and 2nd during our open hours, which are 10 to 5 or 10 to 8 on Thursday. And then a couple of I handed these out on the way in to many of you, but if you didn't get them, say so and I'll bring them to you. But we've had several programs related to the exhibition already. Jeff Kintop, the Nevada State Archivist, has spoken. Ron James, the former State Historic Preservation Officer, very much knowledgeable about Nevada in the 1860s, gave a talk last week. On October 24th, a week before Nevada Day, Dr. Greta DeJong from the University of Nevada Reno History Department is going to be talking about the import of the Emancipation Proclamation in Nevada's history. And then on October 16th, a very well-known curator of photography named Toby Jurovics is an expert on Timothy O'Sullivan's photographs. He'll be talking about that combination of photographs, which I failed to mention the concluding chapter of. So there are the 1860s Civil War photographs on the front end of the exhibition. The back end of the exhibition are O'Sullivan's very important photographs documenting the 40th Parallel Survey, the King Survey of the United States Geological Survey in 1867, which sent an exploration group across the 40th parallel and spent a great deal of time in the Truckee Meadows and in the Virginia City area documenting the resources of the American West. And he spent a lot of time in Reno, or what was to become Reno. In fact, trying to sail a boat on the Truckee River, which there's a famous Timothy O'Sullivan photograph of a sailboat on the Truckee, before they realized that it was not a navigable water. So come and see those. But he'll be speaking, Toby Jurovics will be speaking on October 16th. And then we have a very fun party all day on November 1st. So we're partnering with 1864, the Tavern 1864 on California Avenue, to close Hill Street next to the museum for a statehood celebration. And then that evening we have this party called Honest Abe's Imagination Celebration, which is a steampunk-inspired party that night, celebrating the conclusion of the exhibition, which will be attended by, among other people, how many of you, anybody been to Burning Man? So if you've seen the Nautilus art car before, the Nautilus art car is made by a guy named Bob Nye, and Bob Nye is the great, ever so great grandson of Governor James Nye, and the Nautilus art car will be there for the steampunk party as well. We hope that you'll join us in that celebration and speak about it with your friends and neighbors and help make that story one that's well remembered in this community going forward. Thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. We have a few minutes for questions, so I'm going to open it up for questions. If you would identify if your question is for Judge Weller or Mr. Robertson, I would appreciate it. So let's see. I see a hand. Paul.
I have a question for Mr. Robertson. What type of security precautions do you have in place for these very important documents?
If I told you, I'd have to kill you. I can say that they're very elaborate. For one thing, one of the reasons that the museum holds this exhibition is that we are the only facility that has the environmental conditioning prospects for and the security prospects for taking it as a document. So the building, our building, is always kept at 68 degrees plus or minus 2 degrees, and the humidity in the building is always 45% plus or minus 2%. Very stringent environmental condition requirements for documents like these very fragile ones. Plus very elaborate security protocols, because it's not a copy, it's the real deal. And so there are security personnel and then electronic security procedures and protocols as well. But they treat it well, right? It's flying first class from Washington with an FBI escort. Yeah, that's it.
Or Judge Weller or Ms. Robertson?
For whoever knows the answer to this. The two constitutions that were on their way and hadn't arrived, when did they show up finally? Do you know?
Well, I know part of the answer.
Go ahead.
One of them arrived in the first week of December in 1864, which is a month too late. That was until fairly recently. The second certified copy was not known, where its location was not known. It was known to have arrived also late, but it was not known. And apparently, the National Archivist, I kind of love that little old Reno can have like a first-person relationship with the National Archivist, which we now do. Wrote to say that both of the certified copies had been located, but they had both, and confirmed to have both arrived too late for it to have been useful with regard to the 1864 elections. So the telegraphed copy was essential.
A good idea.
Other questions?
Well, seeing no more questions, I want to thank everybody for coming out. And I want to thank, if we could give a hand to Judge Weller and Colin Robertson. I appreciate it. Thank you so much. A wonderful presentation. And I'd like to invite you all back next year for our 11th annual celebration. We don't know what the topic will be. I'm sure it'll be great. So thank you very much, everybody. Have a great Constitution Day.